going to have Keith Vandermotten. He is the Managing Director of the Marina Coast Water District that is both a purveyor and a manager of water and has an elected board that serves 33,000 people in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for having me tonight. Kathy asked me to talk about a recent AEM study that we had done recently and how that actually ties into what we're responding to with the FEIR. So I'm going to go through a little more technical information than what you've heard thus far. So if you have any questions, please do ask. I try not to get too technical, so hopefully it's something that you can grasp as we go through it. But really I'm going to be looking at three things, is really how does the AEM look to the current groundwater conditions, to future impacts, and to water rights and harm versus what is in the FEIR and what CalAM talks about in terms of those different things. And Gail had talked about some of that already, and so let me first of all just preface what is the AEM. Some of you may not know what this is. The AEM is called an Aerial Electromagnetic Survey. And what we did is we hired a company to fly a helicopter 395 miles in the North Salinas Valley, and those red lines that you see there are those flight lines. So these are all the flight lines that they flew back and forth. And what they did was they took a 3D image of the basin. So it's like an MRI of our groundwater resources. And from that, we can get a really good understanding of not only what's called the hydrostratigraphy, which is the soils and everything else that are down there, but we actually get a very good understanding of the distribution of water quality. But the flight isn't of itself complete without actually looking at real-world information. And so we looked at over 300 wells to do what's called ground truthing. And so you look at the lithology in the wells and the water quality in the wells, you match it up with this image, and you come up with a very comprehensive view of what's going on underneath the ground, much more so than you can with just a sporadic field of 8 or 9 monitoring wells. And so it's very, very useful information, and so I'm going to go into how we were able to use that as we're responding to the FEIR, but before I do, I also wanted to at least orient you in the sense that our aquifer is actually kind of a layer of different aquifers in this area. And so I just want to at least kind of explain this so you can understand a little bit more what we're talking about. At the top is this area that we call this dune sand aquifer. It's the most shallow aquifer. Sometimes it's called A aquifer, has different names, but we call it the dune sand aquifer. Below that is the 180-foot aquifer. Below that's the 400, and not shown on this is the deep aquifer. So we have these layers of aquifers in these areas. And all of these aquifers actually are interconnected at different points. They're not completely distinct. They are symbiotic. So Gail talked about what is the current condition that most people talk about as far as our groundwater in the area. And the 180 aquifer is this one on the left, so that's the second deepest aquifer we're talking about. And the story that's being told today is that everything behind this line is completely intruded, has no beneficial use, can't use the water. 400-foot aquifer, this is what they say it looks like. And oh, by the way, there isn't a map that talks about the dune sand aquifer. It's not even mentioned. It's as if it doesn't exist.
Keith, are those maps based on the AEM?
These are not, actually. Thank you for that segue. This is what the AEM data looks like. And so the blue marks are actually sources of groundwater by state and federal standards. And so I listed the CEMEX side here. It says CEMEX and X, I guess somehow the number. But basically this is where the slant wells are going to be. And then when you look at the blue, it's actually shaded from dark to light blue because this is actually a depth. So the deeper down it goes lighter. So this is almost a 3D image, if you will. But what we see is in the dune sand aquifer, there's these large areas of beneficial groundwater. In the 180, and here's this, that I drew a red line to where what the county map showed was all intruded by salt water. Well, the blue shows that that doesn't really match what the AEM shows in the 180. The county maps had no map to show what's going on here. And in the 400, well, actually, you know, they actually did a pretty good job. What we're seeing is that in the deep aquifer, there are more intruded areas, and perhaps maybe that is true, that the 400 has more of an intrusion area. But certainly the 180, the dune sand, we're seeing a lot more fresh groundwater there that really has beneficial uses. This is the source of our groundwater. It must be protected. And so when you look at, first and foremost, if I were to summarize the current conditions based on what is in the FEIR versus what the AEM shows, is that the CalAM and county maps are really assuming incorrect or missing information with regard to what currently exists with the quality of the groundwater in that area. The second is the AAM confirmed that there's unique groundwater recharge conditions in this area. Now there's several studies that have been done have discussed that, going back several years, and up until we did the study, nobody's really looked at it recently. This confirmed that there is something unique going on in this area. There is unique recharge from the dune sand aquifer into the 180 aquifer. And it confirmed significant volumes, and I listed them here, and somehow the resolution on this screen doesn't match mine on my computer, unfortunately, so things are getting cut off. But this is what the AEM study as a volume determined was sources of drinking water that currently exist today in each of these aquifers. Nearly 1 million acre-feet of water in the dune sand, almost 1.7 in the neighborhood in the 180. The 400 was a little bit less. Yes, Mike.
So you're calling beneficial groundwater drinking water? Is that the 500 milligrams of soda?
I'm actually going to show a slide on that a little bit later.
All right.
What I'm using for sources of drinking water is the state standard for sources of drinking water.
All right.
So that current conditions, that's kind of how those things compared up. But let's look at what happens in the future. What's predicted to happen as part of this project? So if you go to the FEIR, one of the important things to look at is actually water level. So before we're looking at water quality, now if you want to say, okay, what's going to happen when we pump, you got to know how the water levels are. Those play a big role. If you look here, this is the 180 aquifer. These are all contours showing water levels. What's really precarious is here's the Salinas River. None of these lines go down past the Salinas River. There's no data. There's no water level information there. So then you go into the FEIR report and you look at, okay, well, they're going to predict a capture zone from this project. Here's the slant well, here's the drawdown. All of this water within this area is called captured water. It goes into the well. Anything over here doesn't, because you know why? They say that the groundwater flow goes in this direction. It goes inland. So anything that goes inland, it's not going to get captured in the project. So it's very important to get this right. Which direction is the water flowing in the dune sand aquifer? So they assume it's flowing inland. There's no contours showing anything about that. But what does the AEM show? And what does other well data show? Well, before I get into that, I guess we'll have to wait. As a result, what they're showing in their model, if you look at their model results, is they have this particle tracking saying they're pulling in water all the way from the extents of the intruded zones from those county maps. They also show something that's a little different and a lot more conservative with these zone capture maps, which is different than this, but a lot more conservative, saying they're only going to capture water in this general vicinity, and all this water is almost entirely no good. Now I say entirely no good because we know there's some water they're planning on returning, but for the most part they're saying it's going to get intruded over time, it's all seawater anyways, it's no good, don't worry about it. But if you take those same contours that they said, the conservative contours, and you overlay those on the AEM study, look what that's happening. It's going right over that's the dune sand aquifer. So that's pulling all that water in. The 180 aquifer right there as well. It's not good. And so now when we're looking at the water levels in this area, these are contours actually from the Fort Ord cleanup. There's hundreds of wells in the area that we actually looked at the water level information in addition to what the AEM shows as water levels. And we confirmed that the water levels in the dune sand aquifer are actually flowing towards the ocean. And what's happening is it's mounting at the ocean, creating a local groundwater barrier against seawater intrusion in this area. It's very unique, south of the river. It's not the case north of the river, certainly the case right here locally. We also know that these aquifers are interconnected. Again, there's holes or missing aquitars, so whatever happens in the dune sand aquifer will go down to the 180 aquifer, will go down to the 400 aquifer. You have to look at them as a family of aquifers. You have to keep them all protected. They do have a symbiotic relationship. And so if you were to look at it from a schematic, this is in our recent AEM report, our final report, is you have this flow going towards the coast. You have the seawater barrier here and the flow going back into the 180 aquifer. This is the source of drinking water. Wow. As we had mentioned before, we have the 400 aquifer, and yes, there's definitely intrusion going into the 400 aquifer. That's true. And that is limited beneficial use. We want to actually move that back, and as a groundwater sustainability agency, that is going to be one of our tasks in the next 20 years, is to work out moving that back out to the ocean. But certainly, if this goes away, this goes in further. So it's important we keep this barrier. Not only that, but if this barrier goes away, this all is going to be hatched like that. So this whole area becomes intruded. One of the reasons why it's important to get your water levels right, this is the map showing groundwater gradients going inland. This is what happens when your groundwater gradients actually go towards the coast. Your capture zone completely changes. If you were to model it differently, you're seeing your capture zone expands exponentially. It's so important you get those water levels right. It plays a large role in trying to figure out where the water is going to enter into your project. So what can I say about future impacts? There's an incorrect landward flow, and so it underestimates the capture zone, first and foremost. So unless they get the groundwater right on the flow, that's going to be a problem. Even if they got that right and it was the more conservative, it's still capturing good groundwater, and it's still going to eliminate that barrier that exists today. That barrier cannot be eliminated. It plays an important role to make sure seawater doesn't come in this area. And I mentioned we're a groundwater sustainability agency. If this project moves forward, it really works at odds to our efforts to reduce seawater intrusion, to actually change the gradient even more so. So as I mentioned, the gradient right now is towards the ocean, and that increases the capture zone. Just wait until we do really good work and we make that even more of a gradient. That's more water in the capture zone. So they're at odds. There's no way that you could move forward with a sustainable project and at the same time be pumping at the coast and trying to induce seawater intrusion. They're incompatible.
So folks get a sense of scale. How many acre feet does Marina Coast deliver each year to its customers?
Right now, it's in the neighborhood of around 4,000. It's a little bit less.
And if this large desal plant is built, how much source water is it going to pull up?
I have a slide on that too. So this goes to Michael's question. So there's a couple differences in how we look at good groundwater from what was in the FEIR versus the standards that we use from the state and the Fed. So when you look at the CalAm models, they're saying that anything that's less than 500 is drinking water, and so therefore if they capture any of that, they'll go ahead and return that to Castroville. I just want to make a point that that's not an impacted area here at all, so it's going somewhere else. So it's great they're returning it, but it doesn't really help. If it's greater than 500, what they're saying is there's no beneficial use, whatever we take is ours. That's the bottom line. So if it's greater than 500, has no beneficial use, don't worry about it. But when you look at actually what the AEM shows of the volume of water, and when you're trying to assess the actual volume of good water, you look at the standards that the state and feds have. The drinking water standards is up to 1,000. The state has a policy that says anything below 3,000 TDS is considered a source of drinking water, period. It doesn't say 500. The feds have it up to 10,000. They say anything 10,000 below needs to be protected as a source of potential drinking water. Now, 10,000 and above, yes. Now you're getting into water that has limited beneficial use. This is maybe equivalent to the 500 that CalAM's using. So the difference is 500 on their end, I would say, is 10,000 on our end. It's a fairly significant difference. But when you look at how much water is really going to be pulled into the project, CalAM shows 7% based on what we've shown with our modeling and the groundwater in the area. It could be up to 22%. The return water obligations using the current formula that they have would say on the low end it's 1,000, but if they're going to be pulling as much water as we believe, it could be upwards of 3,000, which is 3/4 of what the entirety of Marina and Ore produce today. And all of it being pulled right on the coast. So that's a huge impact to the area. And a peninsula user might be interested in this fact too, that amount of returned water has a role in terms of impacting the feasibility of the project. There's a $39.6 million per year annual cost for this project, to develop this project. Initially the project, if you look at the demands, isn't going to be needed necessarily, so that has to go on top of what current ratepayers are paying initially until growth can pick that up, because you have to figure out some way to pay for it. On the low end, as a CalAM user, if I use 10 units a month, that's $177 on my bill today. Maybe some point growth will help to pay for that, but it's not going to be there the day that that project comes on board. Somebody's going to have to pay for it. So I would think from a feasibility standpoint, that's a big problem. If you go up to this point, I mean, it's almost infeasible to say that if I don't use an extra drop of water each month, I'm going to be paying another $200 a month. It's a hard pill to swallow, I have to say. There's other key issues with the modeling, and I bring this up because the model is used as one of the pillars to support so much of the project. First and foremost, and this is really big, Gail had alluded to it, the model does not put any foreseeable uses of the basin in the model. So it does not include all the forward reuse plan. Not one bit. The dune sand aquifer in the model is poorly calibrated, mostly because they imported information from a previous model. They tried to vary different inputs and outputs, but they were never able to calibrate the dune sand. As we showed in the beginning, they didn't even look at the dune sand in a lot of the maps. The model they use is incapable of analyzing water quality impacts, which to me is just inconceivable. That's the one thing that you want to be able to look at. That is the only impact I would think you would want to look at. And because they couldn't calibrate any of this, and it was really hard to understand how to get the model to work, they dropped it and put in a different model called a superposition, where they just try to look at just the impacts of this project without any of the cumulative impacts of anything else. And what that does is it makes it impossible to verify in the field the results of your model. You can't go out and look at what's happening out in the field because you've eliminated what's happening in the real world for just what's happening with this model. So those are really, really bad issues from a modeling perspective, and these are things you wouldn't want to have in a model that you want to trust. So if I were to look at the water rights harm, first and foremost, because there's good groundwater next to the coast, that CalAm is basically saying is not good water, and therefore we're able to pump it and make it developed water. Well, no, you can't get a developed water right to good groundwater, and that's the water that would go into this well. Marina are certainly harmed by the loss of good groundwater. And there's no protections at all discussed in any of the FEIR. It doesn't say we're going to put in a barrier project, that we're going to work to do something to prevent or protect from this from happening. There's nothing. And when you look at the AEM data and the state federal water quality standards, I would say that the project appears to even approach an infeasibility level. Now that's not necessarily our issue, but it's a regional issue, and we're trying to find regional solutions. I mean, we should be concerned what our neighbors are paying, because we want a solution that works for everyone. The complexity of the model itself is really used to hide the harm and water rights issues, and this is unfortunate. The model is very hard to understand. I would guess even the CPUC does not understand it. Most people don't understand the flaws in that model. And it's unfortunate because one of the pillars that's used over and over again to point to why there's no problems with this. And so that's a real unfortunate thing. In addition, because the model does not use any of the forward or foreseeable uses, it appears to almost be a backdoor to how to explain how you can get an appropriated water right. Because in the FEIR, CalAm discusses that Marina Coast has no rights to the water, and it's first in time, first in right. So they're almost saying that, well, we're not going to look at those future uses. If we can get in here, that's really our water anyways. It's an appropriate right because by California law we can get in first. But the bottom line is that the CPC approves this, it'll transfer CalAm supply issues onto others. It will, because now Forward no longer has those allocations. The Forward reuse plan cannot move forward as it was envisioned. And all of those costs, all those impacts, and the need to develop additional expensive supply now becomes our problem. Because we will now have to do something other than depend on our groundwater. We may have to at some point anyways, but that would make it a certainty and to a larger degree. So what are we doing as Marina Coast? In the last several months, we've been trying to figure out alternate solutions that actually are regionally beneficial. I think we've looked at expanded pure water Monterey. We've offered ways to help support that. We are also developing a recycled water project and have excess supply for a period of time and offered to help to put that into the mix, because those together could give CalAm foreseeable supply for the next 15 years, and in that time perhaps we can look at relocating the wells, doing a different type of well intake, horizontal directional drilling, moving them north of the Salinas River where it is actually intruded, perhaps that would be a better place, moving the location. These are all regional solutions that I think we would hope we could help the peninsula find a solution, but what is being presented to us today isn't a good regional solution. And so we've been trying to figure out a way that we can work together and find something that works for all of us and buy us some time to fix these problems. And because we weren't able to at least get to that, we asked the CPUC to refer the water rights issue to the state board. We believe the state board needs to hear this. At this point, nothing in the CPUC process has spent any time in an evidentiary hearing looking at what we've talked about today. And there's no schedule to do that. None. Nobody's looking at this information. It's just going to go through as an EIR, as just believe us, it's in our report, and approve it so we can move forward. So we've asked the state board to come in and look at this. The state board is also the one that issued the cease and desist order. They're the ones that are in charge of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and they have the capability to look at water rights. So it makes all the sense in the world that they would opine on this and say, okay, with your AEM study, with what you're presenting, this is what we would conclude as an issue.